The sun was still low in the sky when the man packed up his fishing rod and small tackle box. The cool air drifting over the lake carried the smell of fresh water and pine. The ripples on the surface shimmered in soft gold light, and he felt that deep calm he always did whenever he sat at the water's edge. This lake was not just a place to catch fish. It was a place tied to his childhood. His grandfather had taught him how to fish here. His father had shown him how to row a small boat across the shallow end, and he himself had spent countless mornings sitting on the worn wooden dock with nothing but silence, the water, and the waiting pull of the line. He reeled in his catch for the day, a few small bass he would release back, and he smiled faintly, whispering that it had been a good morning. He packed his things, walked the familiar path back up toward his house, and felt that same peace lingering in his chest, but it shattered the moment he saw it, lying bright and sharp against the dull wood of his porch sat an envelope, bold red letters stamped across the front screaming notice. His steps slowed, his stomach twisting. He bent down and picked it up, the paper crackling in his hand. Inside was a letter from the HOA. The words printed with cold formality. It said he owed $500 for illegal fishing on community property. His eyes widened as he read the lines twice, then a third time, his hands shaking as anger surged through him. Illegal fishing, $500, on the lake that had always belonged to his family, the lake beside his property. The same water he had walked to since he was a boy. How could this be? He paced across the porch, his boots striking heavy against the wood, his heart beating fast. He looked back toward the lake, its surface calm and innocent, yet now tainted by the accusation. What game was the HOA playing? He thought of the president. Her smug smile at the last community meeting when she had announced new rules about paint colors, mailbox sizes, even lawn decorations, her voice dripping with authority. But never once had she mentioned the lake, at least not openly. Why now? Why target him? He crumpled the paper in his fist, then flattened it again, reading every line carefully. The fine was due in 7 days. Failure to pay would result in further penalties. His jaw clenched, sweat forming on his neck. They were not just fining him, they were testing him, pushing to see how far he would bend, but he would not. He dropped into his chair on the porch, the letter still in his hand, and stared out at the horizon. The tree line framing the blue water, memories flashing through his mind, his grandfather's laughter, his father's steady hand on his shoulder, his own boyhood shouts when he had caught his first fish. This was not community property. This was family history, blood and roots and years of quiet mornings. How dare they try to take it? A cold breeze moved through the yard, and he shivered, not from the air but from the thought that this was only the beginning. If they could charge him $500 today, what would they try tomorrow? The silence pressed heavy around him, and in that silence he felt the slow burn of something darker than anger, a sense of war building on the edge of his land, and he whispered to himself that he would not let them win. The next morning the man woke up with the letter still lying on his table. The words burned into his mind. The fine, the threat, the insult of being accused of trespassing on the very water that touched the edge of his property. He could not sit quietly. He pulled on his boots, grabbed the crumpled notice, and drove straight to the HOA office. The building sat smugly near the entrance of the subdivision, its white walls polished, its little garden perfectly trimmed, as if order and control itself had been built into the bricks. He pushed open the glass door. The air inside smelled of paper and polish. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, her smile faltering the moment she saw the letter in his hand. She mumbled something into the phone, and within minutes the HOA president appeared, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, her face smooth and cold like glass. She greeted him with a tone that was polite on the surface but sharp beneath, asking what seemed to be the problem. He slammed the letter down on the desk and told her the problem was that she had fined him for fishing in his own lake. Her eyebrows arched as if amused. She leaned over the paper and tapped it lightly with one finger, saying it was not his lake but community property, that the board had voted to manage it for the safety of all, and that he should be thankful they were protecting him. His blood boiled. He told her the lake had been in his family for decades, that his deed showed the waterline clearly within his property boundaries, that no one had ever questioned his right to fish there. Until now, but she only tilted her head and smiled, saying deeds were tricky things, saying property lines could be debated, saying the board had final authority when it came to rules, and if he disagreed he was welcome to take it up in court. Her smug voice carried loudly enough for the few people waiting in the lobby to hear. They shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between him and her, some whispering softly, The humiliation burned his chest, but he stood his ground, his voice low and steady as he said she had no right, no matter how many papers she sent, no matter how many fines she invented. The lake was his. Her eyes narrowed. Her smile vanished for just a moment, then returned sharper. She told him if he continued to ignore their warnings the fines would double, that his name could be placed before the compliance committee, that his privileges as a homeowner could be suspended. He leaned closer, his jaw tight, and asked her one question. Why was she really doing this? Why now? Her eyes flickered just enough to betray something, a shadow of truth she quickly buried under another smile. She turned away, waving her hand dismissively as she said the matter was closed, that he should pay his fine before it grew larger. His hands trembled as he picked up the letter again, the paper crumpling under his grip. He walked out of the office without another word, his boots heavy on the floor, the eyes of strangers following him. Outside the air was hot, his breath sharp, and he knew then that this was not about fishing. This was about power. They wanted control of the lake and they had chosen him as the first test. He climbed into his truck, the steering wheel hot under his hands, and as he stared out across the road he made himself a promise. They might have their papers, their meetings, their smug smiles, but he had something stronger. He had truth and he had resolve. And he would not let them steal what was his. The man drove back from the HOA office with his fists tight on the steering wheel, the fine still burning in his pocket. But his anger had not cooled. In fact, it grew hotter the more he thought of the president's smirk, her voice dripping with false authority, the way she had said community property as if decades of his family history meant nothing, as if his grandfather had never stood on that shoreline and cast a line into the water, as if he himself had never waded through the reeds as a boy with a net in his hand. The more he replayed her words, the more he knew he could not let it go. When he reached his house, he paced the porch, reading the notice again and again, his eyes catching on the words illegal fishing, a phrase that twisted his stomach. How could something he had always done, something he had every right to do, suddenly be a crime? He slammed the paper against the table and muttered that they wanted to shame him, that they wanted to push him until he gave up. But they would learn he was not that kind of man. The next morning he decided to confront them properly, not just with anger but with evidence. He pulled out the old deed his father had left him, the one with faded ink but clear markings, the property lines traced neatly, the lake's edge drawn firmly within his boundary. He studied it until he could see every detail burned into his mind, then tucked it under his arm and drove once more to the HOA building. When he walked inside, the air felt colder than before. The receptionist looked nervous as she whispered into her phone. And soon the president emerged again, her heels clicking sharply, her face painted with the same smug expression. He stepped forward, laying the deed across the counter. His voice firm but calm as he said this was proof the lake was his, proof they had no right to fine him. Her eyes flicked down at the papers but she did not touch them. Instead she gave a small laugh and said, property lines can be tricky. Sometimes surveys are wrong. Sometimes boundaries shift. The board believes the lake should be shared, and as such the board has authority. His jaw clenched. He told her the board was not above the law, that the papers were clear, that no vote could erase ownership, but she only shrugged, her smile widening, and said if he disagreed he could hire a lawyer. But until then the fines would stand. His voice rose, demanding to know why the HOA suddenly cared, why after all these years of him fishing there they now decided to step in. Her eyes narrowed for the first time, and though her smile returned quickly he caught that flicker of truth. She muttered something about property values, about safety, about new buyers wanting a cleaner community, and in that slip he heard it clearly. They did not care about fishing. They cared about money. They cared about controlling the lake so they could sell an image. He leaned closer, his voice low, telling her he would not pay, that she could stack every fine she wanted, but he would not give her a dime. Her face tightened, the fake politeness slipping for just a second, and she whispered back that he was making a mistake, that the board always wins. His chest burned but he turned and walked away, his boots heavy against the polished floor, the lobby filled with silent eyes watching him go. Outside the air felt thick and heavy, the sun glaring down, yet he felt a strange clarity. The war had begun. The HOA had shown their hand, and he had no choice now but to fight with everything he had. The man spent the next few days walking around with a storm inside him. Every time he looked at the lake he felt both pride and anger. Pride because it had always been his family's water. Anger because the HOA was trying to erase that history with a single piece of paper. But he soon realized that the fight was no longer just between him and the board. Whispers had begun to spread through the neighborhood. When he walked down the street he could feel eyes on him, some sympathetic, others cold. Neighbors gathered in small groups by their mailboxes, their voices dropping low whenever he came close. One evening as he returned from checking his cattle he overheard two men talking near the corner. One said the HOA had done the right thing, that the lake should be shared by everyone, that one man should not be allowed to keep it to himself. The other nodded but his tone carried doubt. He said the lake had always been tied to that property, that everyone knew it. But the first man snapped back that rules were rules, and the board was only protecting the community. The man clenched his fists but kept walking, his boots striking the pavement harder than he intended. Later he heard a group of women outside the store, their voices sharp with gossip. One of them claimed the lake had become dangerous, that children could drown, that the board was right to take control. Another whispered that it was not about safety at all, that she had seen the president talking to a developer weeks ago, pointing toward the water. The man paused in the doorway pretending to check his wallet but listening carefully. Their voices trailed off as they noticed him, their eyes sliding away. He walked out without a word but his mind was racing. The whispers were telling him what he had suspected all along. This was not about fishing, it was about plans, money, and control. At night he sat on his porch staring out at the lake, the water glowing silver under the moonlight, and he thought about how his neighbors were being pulled apart, some siding with the board out of fear, others too quiet to speak but clearly uneasy. Children still came to the edge of the lake to skip stones or chase frogs, but their parents looked around nervously as if expecting someone to shout at them. The air in the neighborhood grew thick with tension, every conversation laced with the board's power. One afternoon an old man who had lived down the street for decades walked slowly up to the porch. He leaned on his cane and told the man quietly that he remembered when his grandfather planted the first trees by the water, that he remembered family gatherings and fishing trips long before there was any HOA. He shook his head and said the board was greedy, that they were twisting the story to suit themselves. The man felt a flicker of comfort hearing those words, but the old man warned him too, saying the board never fought fair, saying they would not stop until they got what they wanted. The man thanked him but inside his determination only grew. The whispers, the gossip, the quiet fear spreading through his neighbors' voices all told him the same thing. The HOA was pushing hard, trying to divide them, but division could also backfire, because for every neighbor who repeated the board's lies there was another who doubted them, another who watched silently and waited, and the man knew that sooner or later the truth would cut through. But until then he would stand alone if he had to, watching the lake, listening to the whispers, and preparing for the next move in a fight that was just beginning. The man woke up before dawn, the mist rising over the lake like a white veil. He carried his rod and small box down the narrow path, his boots wet with dew, his heart still heavy but steady, because no matter what papers the HOA threw at him, this was his land, his water, his peace. He cast the line into the quiet lake, the ripples spreading slowly, but the calm did not last long. As the sun began to rise he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him, voices low but sharp. He turned and saw 3 HOA board members walking toward him, their arms folded, their faces twisted with self-importance, and behind them stood the president herself, her eyes cold as steel. They stopped a few feet away and told him in clipped voices that he was trespassing on community property. He laughed bitterly and told them to look at the deed, that this was his lake, his land. But they only shook their heads and one of them pulled out a phone, saying if he refused to leave they would call the sheriff and have him removed. The man's stomach twisted, not with fear but with fury. He told them to go ahead, call whoever they wanted. Because he was not moving an inch, the president smirked and nodded, and within minutes the distant sound of sirens broke the morning air. A sheriff's cruiser rolled down the dirt path, its tires crunching against the stones. The neighbors who had been peeking through curtains now gathered quietly near the street, whispers spreading as they watched the law arrive. The officer stepped out, a tall man with a serious face, his eyes scanning the scene. The board rushed toward him, talking over one another, waving their arms, pointing at the man by the water, their voices rising as they accused him of breaking rules, of fishing illegally, of disrespecting the community. The officer held up his hand for silence, then turned toward the man who stood calmly by his rod, his deed tucked under his arm, his boots planted firmly on the shore. The officer walked closer and asked him for his side of the story. The man handed him the papers, the old maps and the clear boundary lines. The officer studied them carefully, his brow furrowed. He asked quiet questions. How long had the lake been in the family? How long had he been fishing here? The man answered steadily, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of years, telling him how his grandfather had passed the land down, how no one had ever disputed it until the HOA arrived. The officer nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced back at the board, their faces growing pale. He handed the papers back and cleared his throat, saying the land appeared to belong to the man, saying there was no reason to remove him, saying that unless the board could provide stronger evidence there was nothing more to do. The president's face twisted with rage. She stepped forward, shouting that the officer was making a mistake, that the board had authority. But the officer's voice turned firm, telling her authority had limits, telling her that property rights were clear. The neighbors watching from a distance began whispering louder, some even nodding to each other. The officer tipped his hat to the man and walked back to his cruiser, leaving the board standing in silence, their power cracked, their pride wounded. The man picked up his rod again, casting into the lake as if nothing had happened, his chest steady. But inside he knew this was only the beginning, because the HOA had tasted defiance and they would not let it go. Yet he also knew something else. The sheriff had not taken their side. The neighbors had seen it with their own eyes, and the cracks in the HOA's wall of power had just begun to spread. The board members shuffled away, their voices low and bitter, the president's glare cutting like a blade, but he did not look away. He stood tall against the water, a single man with a fishing rod and a deed, and in that moment he felt the fight tilt ever so slightly in his favor. That night the man could not sleep. The sound of crickets outside his window did little to calm the storm inside his chest. He kept replaying the scene at the lake, the sheriff's steady voice, the way the board had shuffled away in silence. The president's glare sharp as broken glass. He had won that round, yes, but something told him the fight was far from over. The HOA would not give up so easily. They had too much pride, too much greed, and too much hunger for control. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the moonlight dancing on the lake, and he whispered to himself that he needed to know why. Why after all these years of peace they suddenly wanted the lake, why they were risking humiliation just to push him out. The answer came sooner than he expected. The next day he drove into town for supplies, his mind heavy but his eyes sharp, and as he loaded bags into his truck he overheard two men talking by the hardware store. They spoke in low voices but their words carried enough to reach him. One said he had heard the president was meeting with a developer, pointing at maps, talking about new lots. The other chuckled and said if they could get the lake under HOA control they could sell lakeside property for triple the price. The man froze, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching. On the bags, so it was true. This was not about fishing, not about safety. It was about money, about selling pieces of his family's history to strangers who cared nothing for the land. He turned quickly, his boots striking the pavement hard as he walked back to his truck, his heart pounding, his anger burning like fire in his chest. He drove straight home and sat on his porch staring at the water, his eyes dark with fury. The whispers were true. The board wanted to erase him, to take the lake, to turn it into a marketing tool for their greed, and they had started by trying to humiliate him with a fine. He thought of the president's smirk, her dismissive voice, the way she had told him to pay or face worse, and now he understood. She was not protecting the community. She was preparing to sell it piece by piece. He stayed on the porch long after the sun went down. The air thick with the smell of wet earth, the crickets loud, his mind racing. He remembered his grandfather's voice, telling him that roots matter more than branches, that what is buried deep cannot be torn away easily. He pressed his hand to the arm of the chair and whispered that he would not let them take it. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how many lies they spread, he would fight, and he would win. 2 days later his suspicions were confirmed. He returned from the store again and saw the president standing at the far side of the lake with two men in suits, clipboards in hand. They were pointing at the shoreline, their lips moving quickly, her laugh sharp in the quiet air. His stomach twisted as he crouched low behind the trees, watching, listening. He could not hear everything but he caught enough. Words like subdivision, profit, potential. Their eyes scanning the water as if it were nothing more than a prize to be carved up and sold. His blood boiled. He wanted to charge forward, to shout, to tear the papers from their hands, but he held back, his jaw tight, because he knew anger would not win this war. He needed a plan. Something stronger than rage, something they could not erase with lies. That night as he sat once more staring at the water, he made his choice. If they wanted the lake then he would make sure it was his in every way possible. not just by history or by memory but by law, by title, by ink as unshakable as the roots beneath the ground. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low but firm as he whispered into the night. They think they can take it, but soon they will learn. This lake is mine, and I will never let it go. The man woke early the next morning with his mind already racing. He could not push away the image of the president standing by the shore with those men in suits, their clipboards, their greedy eyes scanning the lake as if it were a product waiting to be sold. His anger had hardened into something sharper now, no longer just fury but resolve. He knew waiting would only let them tighten their grip. If he wanted to protect the lake, he had to strike first. He spent hours at his kitchen table spreading out old documents, deeds, and maps, papers that smelled of dust and history, his grandfather's handwriting still scrawled in the margins of some. The ink faded but the meaning clear. He traced the lines with his finger, following the boundary that reached down into the water, every mark telling him the same story, that this was his land, his family's land, passed down with care and never contested until now. He gathered them into a neat pile and drove into town, his boots heavy as he climbed the courthouse steps. Inside the air was cold and smelled faintly of stone and paper. Clarks looked up in surprise as he approached with the bundle in his hands, his voice steady as he asked to see the records of the lake. They flipped through thick ledgers, pulled maps from drawers, and compared every line. Hours passed as he sat waiting, his chest tight with a mix of fear and hope. Finally an official returned, laying down papers that confirmed what he already knew. The lake lay squarely within his boundaries, no ambiguity, no mistake. But then came the moment that shifted everything. The official told him he had the right to file for exclusive water rights and protective ownership, to make sure no outside group, not even the HOA, could claim control. The process would not be cheap. The man's heart sank at the number. But then his jaw tightened. He thought of the board smirks, the humiliation of the fine, the whispers in the neighborhood. And he knew money was nothing compared to the cost of losing everything. He signed the papers, his hand firm, the sound of pen against paper echoing like thunder in his ears. With each stroke he felt stronger. The official stamped the documents, the sound sharp and final, and handed him the proof. The lake was his, not just by family history but by law, by title, and by rights no board could touch. When he stepped back into the sunlight, the air felt different, the weight on his shoulders lighter. Though he knew the fight was far from over, he drove home and parked by the shore, stepping out with the papers still warm in his hands. He stood at the edge of the water staring across its rippling surface. The same water that had reflected his childhood, his father's lessons, his grandfather's stories, and now his own struggle. The lake seemed to whisper back at him, steady and calm, and for the first time in weeks he felt ahead of the HOA. Later that evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, he hammered a post into the ground near the dock, the wood strong, the nails ringing sharp in the quiet air. He mounted a new sign on it, the letters bold and clear, private property. His eyes narrowed as he added a second line, trespassers will be prosecuted. He stepped back, his chest rising with deep breaths. This was his declaration, his answer to their threats. The sign gleamed in the fading light like a sword raised high, and though the fight was not yet finished, he smiled faintly. Because he had made his move, a bold move, one the HOA could not ignore, one they would choke on. And deep down he knew the war had truly turned in his favor. The next morning the man stood on his porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, the steam rising in the cool air while his eyes never left the bold new sign hammered into the ground near the lake. The letters private property and trespassers will be prosecuted gleamed bright in the early light. It was more than just wood and paint. It was a declaration, a wall made not of chains or fences but of law. It was the line the HOA could no longer cross. At first the street was quiet, but soon words spread like fire. Cars slowed as they passed. Neighbors stopped at the edge of their yards whispering and pointing. Some smiled faintly, some frowned, others looked fearful. By noon a small group gathered near the lake's edge, their voices sharp, and at the front of them stood the HOA president, her face red with rage, her heels sinking slightly in the soft earth as she marched forward, her voice cutting across the water as she shouted that the sign was illegal, that the board had not approved it, that he had no right to restrict community access. The man stepped down from his porch slowly, his boots thudding against the ground, the papers proving his ownership tucked neatly under his arm. His voice steady but strong as he told her the board had no say. The county had already recognized his rights. The lake was his and his alone. The crowd murmured at his words, some gasping, some clapping softly. The president's face twisted further. She shouted again that the board would sue, that the courts would side with them. But her words rang hollow now, because she could see the doubt in her neighbors' faces. She could feel their eyes shifting away from her and toward him. The man walked closer to the sign and planted his hand firmly on it, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear that the days of the HOA's bullying were over, that no one would fine him for fishing in his own water, that no one would steal from his family again. His voice carried across the lake and echoed back, steady and sure. The president tried to argue, her voice rising higher, but her own board members shuffled nervously behind her, their eyes avoiding hers, because they too had seen the stamped documents. They too knew the truth. The man lifted the papers into the air, the seal shining in the sunlight. Proof undeniable. Proof. Stronger than threats. The crowd erupted in whispers, some neighbors nodding firmly, others shaking their heads at the president's arrogance. The man returned to his porch, his shoulders broad, his chest calm, and as he sat he saw the children of the neighborhood running down to the shore, stopping just short of the sign, their laughter carrying in the breeze, their parents calling them back gently. The lake had always been a place of joy, but now it was also a symbol, a reminder that one man could stand against the machine of the HOA. The president eventually stormed away, her face pale beneath the fury, her heels striking the ground hard, but everyone could see it. The cracks in her power had widened. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the water, and he allowed himself a small smile, because he knew the sign was not just a warning. It was a victory flag planted deep in the ground, a promise that the HOA's days of control were numbered, and he could almost feel his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, steady and proud, whispering that the roots always win. The news of the sign spread through the neighborhood faster than fire in dry grass. By the end of the day, everyone knew that the man had not only refused to pay the fine but had gone further. He had shut the HOA out of the lake completely. The board members gathered that evening in their small meeting hall, their voices sharp and angry. The president slammed her hand against the table, declaring that the man had humiliated them, that if they allowed him to stand, then every homeowner would believe they could ignore the rules. Her voice shook with fury as she promised to crush him. But even among her loyal supporters, unease was beginning to grow. Some muttered that the documents he held were legitimate. Others worried about the sheriff siding with him. Yet the president silenced them, her pride too deep to allow doubt. She swore they would file lawsuits, bury him in legal threats, and force him to bow. The next morning, thick envelopes appeared in his mailbox, letters filled with demands, accusations, and warnings of court. The man opened them calmly, his hands steady, and then placed them neatly on the table beside the stamped proof of ownership. He smiled faintly because he knew their threats were paper while his rights were stone. Still, the HOA pushed harder. Their president walked door to door telling neighbors the man was greedy, that he had stolen the lake, that he was trying to ruin the community. Whispers spread again. But they sounded weaker this time, because people remembered seeing the sheriff walk away. They remembered the man holding up official documents, and deep down they knew the board was lying. One by one, neighbors began to push back quietly. Some refused to attend meetings. Others spoke in hushed tones that maybe the HOA was the problem, not the man. The president tried to organize a rally at the lake, demanding the sign be removed, but only a handful showed up, and when they stood there shouting, their words fell flat against the bold letters of private property. The man sat on his porch watching them with calm eyes, his silence heavier than any argument. Eventually the crowd dispersed, their anger dissolving into embarrassment. The backlash only grew as local papers caught wind of the story. A small article appeared with the headline "Homeowner Fights HOA Over Lake Rights," and it spread quickly online. Comments flooded in mocking the HOA, praising the man, and calling the board petty bullies. The president's face turned pale when she saw it, because now their fight was no longer private, it was public, and the tide of opinion was against her. Lawsuits came, but they crumbled as soon as the county records were presented. Each time the man's lawyer held up the stamped proof. Each time the judge dismissed the case with a wave of his hand. The HOA burned money chasing a battle they could not win, their members frustrated, their funds drained, and their power shrinking. The man stayed steady, fishing at dawn, sitting under the sun with his rod while neighbors drove by and waved, his presence by the water itself a quiet victory. The HOA president raged in silence, but everyone could see it now. Her grip was breaking. The backlash had turned her proud campaign into her greatest humiliation, and the more she fought, the deeper she sank. While the man stood firm like the roots of the land itself, unshaken, untouchable. And stronger with every passing day. The weeks passed. And the battle that had once filled the air with tension slowly turned into a story that everyone in the town whispered about. The HOA had thrown every threat they could. They had sent fines. They had filed lawsuits. They had spread lies at meetings and in newsletters. But each attempt ended the same way, their words collapsing under the weight of the man's documents. Their claims turning to dust when the law refused to stand with them, and now the board was weak. Its members avoiding eye contact in public, its president walking with her head low instead of high, her voice no longer sharp but bitter. The neighborhood that had once been afraid of her power now looked at her with doubt and even shame. Meanwhile the man carried on as if nothing had changed. Each morning he walked down the path with his rod and box, casting his line into the still waters, the lake calm and endless, the same way it had always been. But this time when he fished he was not alone. Neighbors came quietly, some standing at a distance, some walking up to greet him, their voices soft but respectful. They told him they admired his fight, that he had stood when others would have bent. Children skipped stones at the water's edge while their parents whispered thanks. And though he only nodded and kept his calm face, inside he felt something warm, a sense that he had not just defended his lake but also given the neighborhood courage. The HOA tried one last desperate act, the president herself marching to the water one afternoon with two men carrying tools, demanding the sign be removed. But when she reached the shore the sheriff was already there, his arms folded, his voice firm as he told her the lake was private. The sign was legal, and if she touched it she would be trespassing. The men with tools lowered their eyes and stepped back. The president's face turned pale as the neighbors watching began to murmur, some even laughing quietly. She spun on her heel and stormed away, her heels digging deep into the dirt as if the ground itself resisted her. That was the day everyone knew the fight was finished. The HOA had been broken not by shouts or fists but by quiet strength and steady truth. The man sat by the shore as the sun sank behind the trees, the golden light rippling across the water, his rod resting in his hands, his heart finally calm. He thought of his grandfather who had once cast lines into the same water, of his father who had told him to protect what mattered, and he felt their presence in the evening breeze. The sign stood tall beside him, a simple piece of wood and paint but also a monument, proof that he had defended not only his land but his dignity. The neighbors drifted away slowly, their whispers carrying respect instead of fear, their eyes shining with something the HOA could never command, and the man smiled faintly, because he knew the victory was not just his, it was shared, it belonged to the lake, to the memories tied to it, to every root buried deep in the soil, and to every person who had seen the truth. He reeled in his line, stood slowly, and looked across the still surface of the water. The HOA could never step here again. The board that once tried to humiliate him was now humiliated itself, and in that silence, with the evening light fading, he knew the war was over, and he had won it on the shore of his own lake. Months passed after the fight had ended. The lake remained quiet and beautiful, its waters reflecting the sky like glass, but everything around it had changed. The HOA that once carried itself like a shadow over every house now walked with broken steps, its board members silent, its meetings empty, its president gone from the neighborhood completely, her house sold, her name remembered only in whispers of failure. The community that had once trembled at her orders now breathed freely. Families planted flowers in their yards without fear of fines. Children left their bikes in driveways without warnings. And neighbors who had once stayed silent now laughed together openly. The man watched it all with calm eyes from his porch, his coffee warm in his hand, the sign by the lake still standing tall, private property shining boldly in the sun. He had not moved it. He would never move it, because it was more than a sign. It was a reminder, a mark of victory carved into the land. The lake had become more than just his sanctuary. It had become a symbol to the town. People from outside the neighborhood still came to see it. Reporters who once chased stories now returned for follow-ups, their cameras capturing him casting a line with quiet dignity, their headlines speaking of resilience. One magazine even called him the man who taught the HOA a lesson. And though he never sought fame, he accepted it with a small nod, because he knew the story mattered. It told people everywhere that the bullies could be beaten, that roots run deeper than rules. He sat at the water's edge one evening, the sun dipping low, the air heavy with the sound of cicadas, and he thought of his grandfather again, the man who had first placed a rod in his small hands, who had told him that patience was strength. He smiled faintly because he knew his grandfather would be proud. He had not only defended the lake, He had defended the memory tied to it. One night a group of neighbors came to his porch. They thanked him quietly, saying his fight had given them courage, that because of him they no longer feared the HOA, that the neighborhood finally belonged to them again. He listened silently, nodded, and then raised his glass of water with a small toast, saying only that the lake had always been theirs, not the board's. Their eyes shone with gratitude, their voices warm in the evening air. Later when they left he returned to the water, casting his line into the stillness, the moon reflecting silver on the surface, and for the first time in a long time he laughed, not loud, not mocking, but a deep, quiet laugh that came from the soul, because the HOA had tried to break him with fines, with threats, with lies, but in the end it was they who were broken, they who were scattered, and he who remained, strong and steady like the water itself. His laugh echoed softly across the shore, mixing with the sound of the lake, a laugh that belonged to him, to his family, to the land, and to the victory carved forever into the roots of the earth.